The first and most obvious thing is, are there listings sitting, or is it just that this is an area where everyone's holding on to their real estate as long as they can and passing it down generation to generation? And so if that's the case,
What's up, everybody? Mason McDonald and Dan Haberkost here with another episode of the Big Picture Blueprint, where today it is just Dan and myself, and we will be talking about what makes land actually desirable. I think that, with people submitting us deals all the time that they think are these killer amazing properties, and looking at listings, looking at leads and everything like that, everyone's always trying to sell whatever it is to make themselves, look smarter, look cool, or make money or whatever. But we are really going to dive into, how to actually assess a land deal to see what's desirable about it.
yeah, and that seems so simple, but we see it done incorrectly so often. I think it's a lot of, people that I kind of use the analogy of the scientist who's never been out of a classroom and all the anecdotal evidence disagrees with their study, and they're set on believing their study was correct when really there was probably a issue with methodology when all anecdotal evidence is to the contrary. And this is the issue we run into with some of these submissions from people who've never walked a piece of land, and their desktop analysis is certain that it's a great deal, but there's something they're missing that if they were actually, an experienced practitioner, they might see.
Yeah, right. Those who can't do teach. And I feel like we're getting the result of that with a lot of the land flippers that are sold on the idea of like, this is a totally virtual business where you don't even have to see the land or walk the property. And that's true. I mean, most of the land that you and I have bought and sold over the years, we didn't walk the property.
Didn't.
Someone did.
Yes.
And if they didn't, usually you end up getting burned on those deals. And, which I've got stories about two of the properties I picked up in that portfolio where one has a house on it, one has like a trailer on it, which they're mine now. I don't care. But just had no idea. But yeah, let's get into it, Dan. I think we can start out a little bit of with the end in mind of with every piece of land, you have to think about who the end user is, or who the end user that is going to be purchasing it from you or taking that assignment contract from you is, whether it's an investor like us, a developer, or an actual retail buyer.
Yeah, this is so important. And sometimes add to that list the recreational user, the hunter. I have such a good example of this. When I was in town a month ago, we stopped to look at a 310-acre piece out east on one of the main highways. I'm still negotiating this. I'm hoping we'll get it. And a really knowledgeable realtor met me over there. And she definitely knows quite a bit about land. She sold a lot of it. But all that she knows, or all that she has experience with, was developers. And land that a big developer was going to take, split really small, and build a bunch of houses. And so everything she was saying was through that frame. And so she was certain the numbers didn't make sense because she isn't even aware of the option to do an exempt subdivision, sell off larger tracts on terms to just end users who want to build their homestead. And that's a perfect example of she didn't think it made sense, but that's because she was only looking through one frame, and there's a whole nother set of end users who will absolutely be buying that land, right? And so that's a perfect example.
Well, and what's funny too is whenever you're looking at all of these things, like you can't always trust the expert.
Yes.
Where she, that realtor is the expert theoretically, but even talking to the local governments, where trying to get answers of, hey, if I was to do an exempt subdivision, meaning the subdivision regulations do not apply to me when doing this, what are the specifications for the roads that I am going to have to build, to meet the standards of the county? And they're like, oh, it's in the subdivision regulations. It's like, well, it's not, and you have to like peel back the layers and everything like that, because even these other people, they're operating their same box that they operate in every day. They hear subdivision and they're like, oh yeah, like the neighborhood that I live in and then it goes to this, even though these people are doing it all day and all night. The expert can't always be trusted. So in taking that into account though, of starting with the end in mind, thinking about who the end user is, I feel like first and foremost, what makes land desirable to whoever the land user is where it's located.
Yeah.
Location, 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 right? And I feel like where uh, what's interesting to me is how many people think that they are going to be the one that sets the standard in a market. And that's something that you and I, have run into a lot of. There's plenty of places where there's absolutely no comparable data that exists because there are no transactions, which means that there's no way to really price it effectively. So how do you think about desirability of a location whenever there's no data to prove whatever your thesis or hypothesis is on it?
Well, the first and most obvious thing is, are there listings sitting, or is it just that this is an area where everyone's holding on to their real estate as long as they can and passing it down generation to generation? And so if that's the case, it could very well be a super desirable area and there's just no inventory. And that's where the local expert really comes in. But beyond that, you just got to look at the basics. Are you close to somewhere that is growing? We got a lead last week in North Carolina, really rural. There were some listings, but it was a huge tract, not ideal for subdivide. Probably would sell it all together and or a couple pieces of it. And there's just no sales anywhere near that price. Only a few small ones had sold. I'm like, okay, I don't think this is going to make sense really at any price. It's too far away from all the major cities, too big of a price point. Can't split it up into a bunch of little ones without massive capex expenditures. So proximity to growing areas is at the top of that list, which is pretty obvious. And then what inventory is available. If there's nothing sitting, well, then it might be a desirable area. I've had success a few times. One that I'm under contract to sell right now in South Carolina, there were almost no comps, but we were close to some growing areas. I talked to a local realtor who's like, if you can get something, people will buy it overnight. There's just very, very little available, right? So it's a combination of things.
Yeah, and the thing to realize is there's, to kind of summarize the main point, there's either no transactions because there are no transactions, meaning that it's been in the same families for a long period of time, or it's these large ranch owners, these decade generational owners, or even in, smaller lots that aren't big big ranches or anything like that. It just means they don't change hands.
Yeah.
People buy them. The taxes are cheap. It's, maybe they'll use it one day, but it's not a burden on them. And so there is no data, or there's a tremendous amount of data, but just nothing's moving because there's no desirability. And, with location of, just like Dan said, of proximity to growth, if you are on the outskirts, commutable to a city for a job, or, once again, going back to what we said of like, who the end buyer is, but, I think we're talking a little more residential right now.
Mm-hmm.
But proximity to growing cities, are, and switching gears just a little bit, like the actual access to the land, what are the physical features of the land? What's the topography like? How do you actually get there? Because there's certain pieces of land but the actual access to the property is a lot more difficult. Like in eastern Colorado, for instance, the desirability of a property, even if it's, within a mile or two of each other, one's on a paved road, one's on a dirt road, that makes a substantial difference. But I don't want to get too much into the access and physical characteristics quite yet.
Well, yeah, that is really important though. But let's bookmark that for 1 second. There's more I want to say on that. But one more overarching thing that needs to be said is it's all relative to the price and location. And this is why I dislike a lot of the softwares that just across the board scrub out certain things, because, and this is an extreme example, but it makes the point. A super steep lot in Aspen, Colorado might still be extremely desirable and sell overnight, and someone will spend the money to develop it relative to, we just looked at a steep lot in North Carolina in the middle of nowhere where it's cheap and there's lots of land available. Or, the flood zone lot, the lot covered in a flood zone on the ocean in Naples versus the lot that just happens to be at a low point in a neighborhood in, inland North Carolina that's covered in a flood zone. Two very different things. And so it's all relative to the first point we brought up, which is location. And if it's a desirable enough location, then, sometimes the undesirable characteristics almost become desirable. If it's a steep lot in Aspen, but it has killer views and you're the one that built up there, there's ego behind that. And so it's all relative to location. I think that trumps almost everything else.
No, absolutely. And I think that's what's funny about, went on a showing yesterday with an agent to look at some property, and he kept talking about how beautiful the views are and how cool the topography is and how, you can startle an elk as you're walking down it. And it's like, dude, that's fantastic. That's amazing. How much is the road going to cost
Yeah.
to cut through this?
Mm-hmm.
And so while that topography is fantastic to, a lot of buyers, we had to really reiterate to this agent that, hey, look, it's great. Like, I'm sure it adds value, but it also adds a lot more cost to us at the end of the day. But yeah, I feel like whenever people are doing their due diligence, I think they skip that step sometimes, which, the easiest way, I mean, hop on Google Earth, look at the actual topography and like do the 3D map.
Yeah.
Look at it. And if there's a street view, take a look at what the actual land looks like if you can see it too, because it's, if you're not going to walk the property, you can only see so much from your desktop.
Yeah, that's so true. So 3 things I want to say. Your agent, or that agent example, is a perfect example of him not being aware of who he's selling to. He's pitching you on the wrong thing. I mean, it's part of it because you're going to resell the land, but you're ultimately going to be developing it. And he should have had an idea or the cheapest quote he could find in hand for what road grading is going to be. Another point that relates to what you just said, that Eastern Colorado land, much of what can't be seen on Zillow or even on these 3D maps that provide so much additional desirability is even just a little tiny bit of gently rolling hills and a few trees near what could be a pad site would make one lot sell quicker and much higher, out in Hartselle or Eastern Colorado or some of these areas where a few trees make a big difference. And it's really hard to get a sense of that from your desktop. You got to walk it. And so for me, I won't buy anything that we didn't have someone check in person unless it's obscenely cheap. There's one we offered $3,000 on the other day that, okay, whatever. But yeah.
Well, and it begs a question, right? You mentioned Hartselle, Colorado, which I've done, I don't know, maybe 20 deals at this point in Hartselle. And there is such a wide gap in pricing compared properties with trees versus without trees. How do you figure that stuff out? Because every market that you're in is going to have something quite, like that, where it's like, if you are, on this side, if you're Western facing versus Eastern facing, or if, your land has hills or doesn't have hills, because a lot of it, people make assumptions of like, no, you guys should fund this deal. Look, the 2-acre lot in the neighborhood sold for $20,000. I have a 4-acre lot that'll be able to sell for $40,000. And I have it under contract for $20,000. How do you actually figure out what the physical characteristics of the land are that matter to whoever the end buyer actually is?
2 steps. First step, if you go look at 10 to 12 solds and for sale listings in the area, make sure it's the same area. If I see this all the time, right? This is why the idea of trying to comp a whole county, I think, is just idiocy. But anyways, make sure it's in the same subdivision. Look at a bunch of listings, sold and listed, and what does everybody mention? So an easy example, in a lot of these Carolina markets, both north and south, every single listing that sells says, soil is suitable for standard septic per soil engineer or active septic permit on file, right? And so quickly you find, that's really important to people. It could be, any number of things. I think of years ago doing business in Cape Coral, and a lot of listings would say, impact fees already paid. I forget if that's the right verbiage, but conceptually, there were fees attached to the lots for improvements done by the city, and people wanted to see those paid. And if they weren't, it was going to be worth a lot less. And so usually you can figure it out by looking at listings, especially the solds, and then double check yourself by talking to realtors who sold those listings of, hey, obviously this was important because everyone's mentioning in their listing. Anything else I should be aware of? Are there streets I should avoid? Are there I specifically ask, is there something I might not know, having not done business in this specific area, that could affect the value one way or another? And if they're competent, they'll be able to tell you.
Yeah. And this applies to not just land, but houses too. I remember my first flip property I was looking at, I found it online, sent it to my realtor. I was like, this is great price. Look at the comps in the area. And he's like, dude, that's on the wrong side of Pine, which was a street in, East San Antonio. He's like, this particular gang runs that street. And so crime is super, super high. So you do not want to buy that property. And that's only something that you can get with local knowledge or experience. And that right there, talking about the physical characteristics of the land that make one thing so much more desirable than another, where you need to catch yourself. Dan gave you, two really tangible pieces of advice is if you are making assumptions that is not based on any data because you think it looks great. Like, yeah, there is that nice thing of being able to see, touch, and feel a product and be like, yeah, I can understand why a buyer would want this, but you are not the buyer of that property. And while you're not unique, you need to talk to someone that is going to make sure that you are covering your blind spots because you will catch yourself doing really, really bad deals.
Yeah. Well, just as a overarching point too, I think this brings up the fact that the whole idea of this being a hobbyist business, it's not impossible, but it's much less feasible now that we're in more of a normal market. And there was a time you could just sell anything immediately, pretty much anywhere if it wasn't horrible. And that's not the case. And so you really have to know your product, i.e., actually run a real business and have a clue what you're doing, as opposed to, again, just getting something under contract and trying to flip it to someone for a quick buck without actually having any boots on the ground or any local insight. You've got to do that second level analysis or you're going to get hurt. I had a guy send me a lot in Pueblo West a couple weeks ago. I don't think I've talked, or maybe I've talked about this, and I knew what lot it was immediately because the owner had tried to sell it over and over again. And it's on a horrible hill. The accessibility is terrible. Just the road would be obscene. Could probably sell it. It was like 11 or 12 acres. You could probably sell it for what a 1 acre is worth because someone would eat the cost to develop it just for that. But it was the lemon. And I knew that right away because I know that market street by street. And so he was wasting a ton of time and effort trying to dispo it because he had no local insight. He hadn't talked to any realtors. Any realtor couldn't told him that. So yeah, I'll stop my rant.
No, no. I mean, we both experience it. And so far we've kind of touched on location factors and physical characteristics of the land, but on location, one additional thing that I want to mention of there's certain parts of the country, and it'll be within every state that there are these amenities that are extremely desirable, that make it so where people want to own land close to those amenities. Whether it's, a river for trout fishing or great public hunting land or, theme parks or sports or whatever. But within that, like, looking at our notes, something that I want to skip to that we can spend a decent amount of time on is with who you think is going to desire that land because of what it is in proximity to. You have to really understand the legal and regulatory factors that are in place for that land. Where if you're like, this land is right next to all this great fishing and hunting, a question that people are going to ask if that's how you're marketing it is, can I camp on the land? What are the regulations on the land? Can I hunt on my own property? And I feel like whenever you are looking at the level of restrictions of land, you need to align that to whom your end buyer actually is. Because if you're like trying to sell this land as if it's like this perfect recreational getaway, but the minimum design standards of the HOA are you need to build a 4,000 square foot house, that is looks like this, like there's just a misalignment. And so, Dan, I know you've done a tremendous amount of business in the Southeast with properties that don't have restrictions. What have you seen to be like a desirability that, maybe independent of market is, a zoning factor, a regulatory factor that makes it really, really appealing?
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest is can I put my mobile home here and can I have it here from day one, even before I build? And you would be surprised. I'm thinking of the Panhandle of Florida, and this kicked us in the teeth early this year. We had a great deal. That still ended up being fine, but the county changed the regulation right when we bought it. Hey, I think we've had that happen to us, haven't we, Mason? Yeah, changed the regulation right when we bought it. I forget the nuance of it, but no longer could you, it was like totally unrestricted, and then suddenly you were limited in the amount of mobiles you could park or something like that. We were under contract to sell. The guy was going to park like 4 or 5 mobile homes there, and then he couldn't, so he canceled. And we still sold that deal at a profit. It was fine. But that is probably the number one in both the Carolinas, Florida, Colorado. Can I just park my mobile home here even before I build? And I can't believe how many counties that are rural and you wouldn't think would care, do care, and it is illegal. in so many places, and lots of land is being sold or at least marketed with unrestricted in the headline where it's just not true. And so in Colorado, you can speak to this. There are so few places that actually let you park a mobile home recreationally or an RV, and that's true in the Carolinas and Florida too. And it's becoming more and more restrictive in a lot of counties.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and I feel like, one of the common questions, and it's just, selling enough land where it's like the buyers ask the same questions over and over and over again, regardless of where the land is of, can I, and it usually depends on the price point, where if you're selling like $20,000 piece of land, a lot of people are like, oh shoot, can I park my, you know, can I park my trucks on it? Can I park my semis on it? Can I park, this on it? Or, is it in an HOA? What are the covenants of it? What are the restrictions of the land? And I think that right there, depending on what you're getting into, you need to think about it. Where if you're trying to flip a lot, like that one in North Carolina, like we mentioned, the topography not working out for us, which was a deal killer, but it also has a pretty expensive HOA
Mm-hmm.
where I don't know what the transfer fees are, but there's like a multi-$100 a month HOA dues as well. And so if your model is to try and flip quickly and you have a relatively unique lot in a place where there's not a lot of inventory moving, you can end up putting yourself in a really big hole where you, as the intermediary or the investor or the flipper or the wholesaler or whatever you are, might get stuck with a property that your carrying costs are actually outrageous.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't find that unique end buyer that it actually wants that property, because the HOA is too restrictive or whatever it might be. And I feel like I see that a lot in the Southeast where these, communities have all these crazy restrictions, and you see land sit on the market for years, before it sells. So,
Yep.
yeah, I think that's a big point of the desirability of land is what restrictions are there on it, and does it align with who your end buyer is?
Yeah. So continuing along, let's talk about utilities because you asked me about the Southeast. And one thing that consistently helps me sell properties quicker is if there's actually a water line and they don't have to put in a well. And this is related, but not utilities, obviously, and a paved road. I'll get these rural tracks. My guys will tag me in our CRM. I'll take a look at it, and they have made the mistake. We've learned this, but have made the mistake of having some comps where ours doesn't have paved road access and water, and the comps do, and we think they're the same, even though they're the exact same size, same area, but theirs is right on the highway, and ours is just a little off on a dirt road and doesn't have what. It makes a big difference. So utilities are huge, and I mean, we can talk about perk tests and septic tanks, of course, but yeah.
Well, I think the challenging thing is, and to give you tangible advice on how to look at this is you go into whatever market, has a lot of land that's, maybe truly raw land, that does not have any infrastructure improvements, and then compare it, try and find a similar property that does have improvements on it. Where in Colorado, if your property has electric extended, not just running along the property, but like actually extended to your property and a well on it, I mean, the cost of doing that versus the value it adds, it could double the value of the property, essentially, even though it does not cost that much money to actually install that. Because once again, thinking about the buyer, a lot of them are going to want to use their property immediately and not have to go through. It's intimidating to people that haven't done it. Of what do you mean? Like, how do I get a permit? How do I, contact a well drilling company and get a pump installed? Like, what are all these words? As versus like permitted well on property, ready to go, can add a tremendous amount of value. And when you're looking at comps, that's something to consider, because just like Dan said, of perk test in North Carolina or on a paved road, and so infrastructure and the utilities associated with the property. It's something that I feel like I've, over the years, made plenty of mistakes where my margins would have been less, but I would have turned the deal over a lot quicker if I had done whatever those improvements are that make it so where it can match the comps that are moving quicker at a higher dollar price.
Yep, 100%. There's so many examples of this. Getting the septic permit is a big one. And related to our earlier point, we talked about knowing what's important in your market. Well, I remember getting a deal in Arkansas submitted to us early last year, and I talked to the realtor and said, "Oh, don't we need a perk test?" And he goes, "It doesn't really matter. There's a different type of system that's a couple thousand more expensive you put in if it fails perk test. It doesn't really matter there because of the health codes. Whereas in the Carolinas, a lot of times a failed perk test or a requirement for an engineered septic increase the cost so much that people don't want the land. So these things are all related to each other.
Oh yeah. Well, and you have to understand your specific market because you start hearing this verbiage, and in some places it doesn't matter. I went to a land sale event in Tennessee this weekend where it was unrestricted land, and I asked them of like, oh, as you're selling these, like, do you guys do perk tests? And they're like, no, because in this part of Tennessee, and I don't know if it's statewide, if it's over 5 acres, you don't have to do that. You know, it's just like not a requirement. Like there are no requirements related to perk tests, going through the county regulations or whatever, like the environmental people with the county, if it's over a 5 acre lot. And I'm like, dude, that's crazy. That's nuts. And so learning about stuff like that from market to market is really, really, really important. And I feel like it kind of goes into what you alluded to at the beginning of the show of like, you hear one thing in one market, it does not apply to every market and every end buyer and every piece of property, where flood zone or wetlands can absolutely kill a deal in certain markets, and it can be irrelevant or a plus in other markets that you're working in. And same thing with perk testing of, you do deals in North Carolina and, perk tests are everything, but it's, a 200-acre ranch in Colorado. Like, there's going to be a place on the property that there's decent soil for it, or it doesn't matter. So it does not always apply everywhere. Everything.
I've sold many, many lots in Florida that needed septic, and I've never done a single perk test in Florida. So it's just different from place to place. And one more example, you hit on it there a little bit or referenced it. I was looking at tracts in the Carolinas that would be used for hunting. And it occurred to me as I was reading through some of the listings that a bit of wetlands placed in the right spot on a hunting parcel are ideal because it attracts, one of them was all about waterfowl, hunting waterfowl, right? It attracts animals. And so again, it just can totally change the whole paradigm depending on who the end user is and what sort of land you're targeting. But anyways, I think we've hit on utilities enough, Mason. What else is on here?
Yeah, I think, for the most part, we've been talking about kind of the retail client of, the person that's going to want to live on the land or use the land as versus the developer client or the builder. And I feel like, speaking more to the development aspect of it, you have to know what you're going to be able to do with land, especially on the larger side, larger properties where, I'm looking for large acreage in Colorado. So if you have any large acreage, feel free to send it my way and I'd be happy to take a look at it. But there were a few listings, and it didn't really mention in the listing that there was a conservation easement placed on the entirety of the property, multiple thousands of acres. And so, the pricing was decent, was going to make an offer on it, talk to the broker. I was like, hey, there's not any CRP leases or conservation easements on it. We're developers. We want to develop. And she's like, sorry, there actually is a conservation easement, no development potential. And so whenever you are looking at the criteria of, if a developer or a builder or whoever sends you the buy box, like, the first question you should be asking whoever the lead is like, can you actually do this with it? And it's going to differ from state to state and county to county, but I feel like people get so excited at the concept of a deal of, whatever lead calls you first on your first mailing or first, cold calling list or whatever. It's very rare that they actually have a desirable piece of land that's going to meet that end user, especially on the large acreage, because it might be landlocked or there might be no road frontage or electric might be 10,000 miles away or whatever it might be. So it's really, once again, regardless of who it is and at what level it is, the use of the land has to be able to be converted to whatever the actual end use is for the developer or builder. And that's your job during due diligence to figure that out.
Yeah, and that the parcel of land for large scale development, and to be more specific, piece that you're going to sell to Lennar or D.R. Horton or a regional builder, is totally different. And then you have a whole nother set, not totally, of course, location matters and utilities matter, but then you might be looking at traffic count, and you might be looking at a longer term time horizon as far as plan developments and thoroughfares. There's a new road, well, a road being extended. It's been platted for decades, but it had never been physically built between Pueblo and Pueblo West. And then that has caused other big players to come in because we knew that this was happening about 3 years ago. It was finally going to happen. And so a few other big institutions have come in and bought up land around that. And that was preemptive. It's still not open. 3.5 years ago, some of these people came in. And so if you're dealing with that sort of land, right, a big piece that's along a proposed or current thoroughfare that might be being expanded, or maybe there's other big retailers coming in, then your whole time horizon and the way you look at this changes. An end user, probably just an individual, probably isn't that concerned with what might happen in 3 years as far as additional growth around it or new roads or new businesses, etc. But that big time developer or investor who thinks on a much longer time horizon might look at, your 50-acre piece in a major metro and say, oh, okay, there's a new road coming in 2 years. I will actually buy this, right? They're just on a different time horizon than a whole different kind of set of standards. And so again, it's just furthers the point that you got to know who your end user is.
When I think tangible advice of like what to actually be looking for with that is, there's probably other land listings in the area similar to the lead that came in for you, and look what went into their work in their offering memorandum that they have, posted on LoopNet or their brokerage website or whatever, of like, okay, density study, this is how many housing units short this particular metro is, traffic study, like Dan mentioned, close to this, this water lines, or are you going to have to put in a utility district, or, what are you going to have to do to actually develop the land? And, for some of you, this might be outside of your scope, and it's, try and get a fee or something like that, bringing it to a really solid broker, or, finding a developer that can, take pennies on the dollar, buy it really, really cheap if it makes sense for them. So it just takes a lot more work, the bigger you get, but the main lesson of it all is make sure that whatever the intended use of this developer or this builder, whoever it is, it's actually feasible to be done. Otherwise, you're going to look really silly whenever you start presenting deals and conservation easements to developers when there's no development potential.
Yes. One more idea, thought I have is price point. And what I mean is, what is the capability of the buyer in that area? And so there are lots of places where nobody or very few people have enough money to go and buy a significant chunk of land, but they'd love to buy, a 1 acre or a 5 acre split off from the big ranches. And even that they can't afford. So you have to offer terms. And so I think this is a good example of the project I'm doing out east, a lot of these projects you're doing with the company you're working with now, and some other big operators I know, where if you look at the properties they're buying and you look at solds on Zillow, it looks like there's not a lot of demand, but there is, and people just can't afford cash sales, can't get traditional bank financing, and so you're just not seeing these sales recorded, right? I mean, you know about this, and so again, this is where it comes down to finding local experts and eventually becoming the local expert yourself to know that this demand exists. There's lots of places like this. I've seen this with some of the other big companies I know, where when I look on Zillow, it looks like there's no demand, but they're selling lots like crazy. You're just not seeing it.
And I think on pricing, one of the most common things I see with people submitting deals is, I kind of joked about it before, but it's making an assumption based on, a price per acre, price per square foot of the comp that blows all the other comps out of the water. Of, say every 2 acre lot in this nice neighborhood is selling for 100,000, and you get the 1 4 acre lot in the neighborhood and you think it's going to sell for 200,000. But there has never been a sale in that zip code over 125,000 in the past 3 years. The demographics kind of are showing, or the data is showing that the demographics might not be able to afford that price, and you're looking at it of like, okay, well, maybe not 200 but 190. It's like, well, if the highest sale ever in that zip code is 125, you making an assumption that your property that you happen to get in your inbox from whatever lead source is going to be the most expensive property that has ever sold in the history of that zip code. You're making a really, really dangerous assumption there. So you have to look at what the absorption rate is depending on the product. So, if you want to sell out quickly, you're going to have to be priced below market value. And if you're making an assumption that, just because yours is bigger, it does not always mean it's better. Some areas it's true, where you might have the 2 acre selling for 100 and a 5 acre that sells for 400. And it really, really depends, but it needs to be based on data rather than assumption.
Just reading through our notes, you've got me thinking of a point that relates, which is the shape of the lot. We've gotten submissions where it's the same area, it's a flat lot, maybe the same utilities, price point's the same, but it's just weirdly shaped. And so you have to consider who, again, if this is just being sold to someone to put a house on it, think of how is a home going to fit on the plot plan, right? If you think about the setbacks from all the different sides, can they fit a home? So that's another thing that I've run into a lot is, in theory, this parcel is the same amount of acreage, the same topography, utility scenario, neighborhood, but it's a weird shape. It's just like houses with weird floor plans that can really throw off the saleability. It can take much longer. It can sell much lower. Same thing with land. So even just a square versus a rectangle, how simple that is. But just in these 40-acre tracts that I'm selling out east, the squares are more desirable than the rectangles. And so shape matters quite a bit too.
Oh, yeah. And once again, you can look at the comps and, there's certain properties where it's totally fine if it's a flag-shaped lot, because what might matter to one person versus another is there county road access, or, what is the access of it? And so it's just a lot of time looking at a lot of pieces of land. Like I can't even fathom between the two of us how many actual pieces of land we've looked at over the years. I mean, hundreds of thousands.
Mm-hmm.
And each one is unique and different to a certain extent. There's a lot of areas where the land really actually is the same, but I do feel like, once again, making sure the intended use is aligned with, what the property actually looks like, or for the end buyer of there are so many not illegal, but God, what's the word I'm looking for? Like where it's not standard or whatever. Some weird triangle shaped lot where the setbacks don't meet, non-conforming lots out there where you literally cannot do anything with it. Mm-hmm. Your best exit strategy is to sell it to the neighbor. So that's just something to consider as well.
Yeah. And I'm glad you said neighbor, because I don't think we've explicitly said that, but that's one of the last points I want to make is you have to check out the neighbors. If you're in an HOA, okay, there's much lower risk, but if you're out in rural America, and if this is an unrestricted piece of land, it is more common than not that the neighbors are in rough shape. It's often a competition, I think, to see who can have the most broken down vehicles in their yard once you get more than an hour outside of cities. So make sure somebody looks at this thing in person, and not just for the quality of the neighbors' houses, but to make sure they're not crazy. I mean, I've told the story of the neighbor that ran out with a gun and scared off buyers on a Colorado parcel. A few years ago, I had a neighbor in a nice area, a very nice area, nice community, HOA and everything. He would roll out on his golf cart whenever he would see someone looking at the land, and he would discourage them. Every single buy, it took me like 14 months or 13 months to sell these parcels because of that. And I barely made any money entirely because of that, right? I called the guy and talked to him, but you run into troublesome neighbors. And so it's just another reason why you got to look at the land in person.
Yep, absolutely. You never know what these people are going to do. And a lot of times when you're coming into a new area, you're viewed as the bad guy. And sometimes it can turn into a deal, or sometimes it can turn into something really bad. I think we've both dealt with bad neighbors. I've had neighbors block driveways with boulders. I've had neighbors come out and say it's the cartel that's living all around and all sorts of stuff. And Sometimes you just have to deal with it and sometimes you have to take legal action. But I do think that really, really affects the desirability. But, we've kind of gone through a good amount of different things, talking about location, physical characteristics, the access of paved versus dirt roads, infrastructure and utilities, the zoning regulations, the market in general and the land use. But Dan, anything else that you want to hit on, before we wrap things up of what actually makes land desirable, um, for us as flippers and for the end buyers as builders, developers, hunters, retail, whatever it might be?
Man, if I had to summarize this whole conversation, I would say the old adage of location, location, location remains to be true, and that kind of trumps everything else. And then number two, you've got to just become an expert in the places you're doing business. And before you are an expert, you need to find the expert, or you will get burned, because all of these factors vary substantially depending on that specific area and what those buyers are looking for. And if you haven't done much business there, you could be missing something. So if you're not the expert, find the expert and work to become that person that, like I said with Pueblo West, he sent me a lot and I knew right where it was. I knew I can picture it. And so that's where you want to be. And then you'll have a much better time in this business.
Oh, yeah. And do not make assumptions. Use data wherever you can and don't think you're ever the expert. Even if you've done 1,000 deals out there, like there's still new things that occur because government regulations are constantly changing. And certain things you can't, stick with that way of thinking forever and apply it to every market that you do business in. So hope you guys enjoyed this and found it useful to look out for really positive aspects of land and negative aspects of land. So without further ado, we are going to sign off. This is Mason McDonald and Dan Haberkost with the Big Picture Blueprint.